Okay, so are you okay with the
I'm
technology now, or are you going to keep fussing with it?
I'm gonna keep
Because we're
fussing with it.
because we're recording. So
We're not
we're supposed.
recording.
Yeah, we are. We're recording. So what?
No,
We're on episode what? 16?
16.
Oh, of Gripping Reality. And
Yeah,
your reality is you can't get your tech to work because you don't know how.
I will. Just give me a break.
And we're talking about, what are we talking about?
Me,
Victimhood.
me, the victim here. I have been victimized this entire podcast so far. I've been insulted. I've been derided. I have been criticized. And I'm
And
going
I'm
to
good.
wear that badge for a long, long time.
I'm sure you are, and I don't really care. So, there you have it.
Okay, this is dangerous. This is a dangerous podcast. This is really tough because we're going to talk about addiction to victimhood.
That's right. We are.
Addiction.
Addiction.
We're not talking about just victimhood itself. I mean,
Right.
that's a whole different topic. But we're going to talk about what happens when people become addicted to their victimhood.
Ah, yeah. And we've never seen that before. Not in our world. Not in what we
You've
do.
never seen that before? Do not lie on this podcast. Okay, your nose is growing longer. And the challenge of all this is if we start lying or we start making up exaggerations like we do a million times a day, then I'm not going to believe what we say when we're telling the truth.
I don't know. I always tell the truth. Always.
Always,
Yes,
never,
every time.
ever, never, always language immediately is a red flag that says you're eliminating every piece of information that doesn't contribute to the conclusion you want.
Okay, enough of this nonsense. So, addiction to victimhood. Oh, God, we live in a world in a society that we have raised the level of prestige for being the victim to the top of the pile.
Okay, let's start with a definition because if we're talking about a topic that nobody else has thought of really. I mean, this is not part of the common parlance of our culture right now that people
Absolutely,
are
absolutely.
addicted to victimhood. So how do you define victimhood to begin with? And then what is an addiction to victimhood?
Uh, I would probably turn it around and let's talk about what an addiction looks like,
Oh,
and then define it the other way. Because actually, I'm currently getting my master's in and sexual addiction therapy, and
okay.
so this is kind of relevant to. I mean, I really haven't thought about it when we decided to do this podcast, but it's very relevant, and it's just the definition of addiction, and I'm kind of in the beginning of all of that. But I think that where we find ourselves is that addiction is
So we're doing
something
a
that's
podcast on something that you actually don't know anything about, but in 3 years you will.
no, that's not true,
Is
but
that what
that's
you're
okay.
saying? Are you saying that?
No, I'm not saying that. I think I have a fairly good idea of what addiction looks like,
Okay.
and that
So
is it.
define addiction.
I think in very simple terms, it is something in our lives, whether it's substance, whether it's
Don't
thought
give
process.
examples. Don't give examples. Jump right to the definition.
The definition.
Yes, of addiction.
Addiction is something that you cannot, seemingly, you think you can't live without. You have to have it. And you will have it at virtually any cost, to whether it is pleasurable to you or not, whether it is painful to you or not. You have to have that to define your identity. So your identity is built in to your addiction, and your addiction is doing something for you. It's either masking issues, it's either giving you pleasure, but you have to have it in order for you to be defined and give you that definition of who you are. So I know it's a little wordy, but what do you think?
So take all the wordiness out and give me a definition for addiction.
You have to have it in order to define yourself.
That's use the word need. You have to. You have to. You gotta. Break out of that language and give me a definition for addiction.
You will have it in order to define yourself.
Okay, but a dry alcoholic is still addicted to alcohol even though they don't take a drink?
Yep.
So they don't have to have it.
They do, but they won't. They make a choice not to.
Okay.
So how would you define it?
I define addiction as the relationship between a person and some other reality. Could be a substance, could be a situation, could be a person, but as a relationship between an individual and another object or entity that regulates how time functions. That is, if a person says it has been 12 hours since I had a drink, or in 3 hours the weekend starts and I can get drunk again, they have regulated time by their substance. If they say it has been 1,962 days since I had a drink, and I'm incredibly proud of how long I've gone not having a drink, time is still being regulated by the relationship to that substance. So okay. I think the issue of either the advance of time or the future of time becomes primarily regulated by the relationship between me and the substance or the event. And whether that's killing me or whether that's pleasurable to me, when I define, let's take it out of substance abuse and say internet surfing. I'm on Facebook. I cannot, I think I haven't checked Facebook in 13 minutes. Time is regulated by, I want to check, I'm gonna discipline myself and I will not check Facebook again for 5 more minutes. Time is being regulated by my relationship to that item. That becomes an addiction.
So I think, can we agree that regardless of whether we use your definition of time or my definition of identity, it is something that we believe that controls us, that I know you're not going to like this, we need in order to be able to define the time or define who we are, because it has a hold on us that says this is who I am or this is the time that I used. But it's that hold that is defining either one of those that addiction does to us. So it doesn't matter what the medium is. If you're addicted to electronics, to Facebook, to social media, whatever it is, that either has a time element to it or it has a defining element to you as a person. I can't live without this. I think that's where.
Okay, so let's take that definition and say urban culture, street music, and crowds. And I can't live without crowds or street music. Would you say a person's addicted to urban culture?
I think they can be.
So the challenge we have is coming up with an agreed definition for addiction itself. What we're trying to say is that it's not merely a biological dependency on a chemical. It tends to be because of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous and withdrawal and all the things that are going on with drugs and medication in our culture, that we tend to understand addiction in terms of the biological or chemical processes
Right.
that
Right.
occur when we ingest certain substances. A person
Right.
doesn't become an alcoholic the very first drink they ever have.
Right.
However, a person could be an alcoholic even though they never took a drink if their lives or identities are wrapped around alcohol and they really aren't a person in their own mind
Right.
without alcohol or the effects of alcohol.
Then what becomes even more difficult as we go in these definitions, it's seemingly okay that we understand drug addictions, which is a physical chemical thing, alcohol, which is a physical chemical thing. But then we get into the nuances of other addictions that are not so easily definable at that
Right.
level because there's not a substance. Workaholism, however you say it, right? Consume electronic media, where you're totally possessed by that. Sexual addictions, pornography, all those kinds of things. Then it becomes kind of fuzzy in people's minds of like, well, no, I'm really not addicted to that. I think it comes back to that, the word that you use and I use is control. What is it that is controlling this identity, this time frame that says I can't live without that?
So we've actually, perhaps by wandering around, we've actually gotten perhaps closer to a definition. It
I
is
think so.
when the locus of control of an individual's life moves from themselves to something external.
Yes,
The true
exactly.
control of their life moves to the outside substance. That
I'm
would
good with
be
that.
an addiction.
Yeah, that would be an addiction, and I'm really good with that because I think that fits both what we're describing as being primary and addiction. Because I
Okay,
think
so
those two,
newborn infants are addicted to their mothers.
absolutely.
Is that true? Does
I
that
mean,
fit within our definition? Or is that just a natural dependency that's appropriate?
that's a natural dependency that's appropriate. That's
Okay,
not
so then
addictive.
do we have to add that it's inappropriate control or damage and inappropriate control of an individual's life by an outside force or substance?
And I think that, yes, I would agree with that. It's inappropriate control that has effect of either damaging the individual or someone else because of the effect of the inappropriate control. Does that work?
Kind of, but there are people who are addicted to thrill and it's not really damaging them. They just live for the next exciting, ecstatic experience, which could be mountain climbing with no safety devices or roller coaster rides all over the world, or deep sea diving that goes down below 100 feet and you end up with the bends as you come back. I mean, there are people, we would say they're addicted to an outside force, but it's not necessarily something that's damaging. It could be. Maybe we come back to our favorite two questions. What is it doing to you and what do you do
Right.
with it?
Well,
Okay, so
and my response to that would be, you're right. It may not be doing damage to you, but what is it doing to the damage of those people you have a relationship when you are doing incredibly high risk I mean, when mom is home and she knows that you're doing this, what does that do to her? Because
that's
you
her
are
problem. That's
addicted.
not my problem.
Ah,
If I'm a mountain climber, and my mom died, when I was a kid, and I don't have relationships, and I don't have children, and nobody cares about what happens to me, so I climb mountains, and on beyond vertical with no safety device because I love the thrill. I drive my car like, 7 times the speed limit so that I can zip around corners and feel the forces. I get off on that. That to me is really exciting. The problem, it's complicated. It could be
really?
damaging, but it might not. In the person's mind, it might not be damaging anybody else. It's still an addiction.
Right. And you're just the victim because somebody else says it's damaging them, when it's you that's doing the damaging.
Okay. Now it's my fault I'm damaging myself. That
Yeah.
place makes me a double victim. That's an exponent. I'm a victim to the third power.
You know, if you're watching this, you're probably going to turn it off right about now, because it's like these guys have no idea what they're talking.
So how do we define victimhood if we're going to be addicted to it? What are we really talking about here? I mean, clue me in, because I'm half of this conversation. I have no idea what you're talking about.
Neither do I. So I'm not sure why we're doing this today. No, I think we had this discussion yesterday.
I know why, because you forced this conversation on me and jammed it down my throat. So now that I have no real freedom in this conversation, you're the person who's like in total control, and I'm just being yanked along by my hair, trying to have a life, but you won't let me have one.
Thank you. That was a great illustration of what
I'm playing the victim here.
I know this. I got it. I got it. I mean,
being a victim, there's a real science behind being a victim professionally. There really is. Stop laughing at me. I know you're laughing with me. That's what all abusers say.
No, I'm laughing at you.
I am not laughing. Oh, I really am a victim here. And can't somebody come to my defense? Anybody out there? I knew it. I knew nobody would come to my defense.
I think it's we're going to define the victimhood. It really boils down to what we teach all the time, and that is when
all the
you
time,
are not
every time, all the time,
every time.
You got to take that stuff out of your language. We don't teach this all the time. Matter of fact, this is the first time we've ever taught it, so we don't teach it all the time. What do we teach all the time?
When we have the opportunity to share, we share from time to time the whole concept of ownership. We don't do it all the time. We do it frequently. And that is where victimhood becomes a very real thing, is when we don't own what's it doing to me and what do I do about it. Instead, that's projected on someone else or something else that controls my life. I'm allowing it to control my life. And my response is, I don't have any responsibility here. Now, before we go too far into this, there are true victims. And both you and I would agree on that. There are true victims.
So before we get to victimhood, then, give a definition for what it means to be a victim. This sounds really clinical, but it's important for us to be able to say the boundary to define victimhood is different than a person who has been victimized or is a victim. So we're using the same word, but we have to come up with some definitions here that give us boundaries that we can talk not only safely and appropriately about this very difficult topic, but we can talk about it therapeutically. We can actually get somewhere towards healing and resolving if a person is caught there. So what's a victim?
You get to answer it this time because you maybe start with the addiction. So
right.
How would you define a victim?
In the area of the 5 basic emotions, and which is the larger, it's the interaction all the way across. A person is a victim who has been wounded or has suffered damage at the hands of self, a force or factor, or another person or persons. The individual suffering a harm is a victim. And that harm can be anything from psychological to spiritual to mental to physical. It can be an abuse that damages economic prosperity or the ability to function. It has to do with a person suffering a wound of some kind, damage at the hands of self or some external force. That person becomes a victim. And what does it do to me And what am I going to do with it? Those are extremely important questions. So we're not saying that victim status doesn't exist. We're saying it does. And it's extremely important to be able to face that and deal with that. But victimhood is something different.
Right. So would you also say in that definition, because I agree with that definition, but also to insert in that this transpires to you by no fault of yours or no initiation of yours to begin with. It is done self otherwise that has caused this to come back on you versus you being the primary initiator of what's taken place to you. Would you agree with that? Innocence.
Follow that. Say that.
Innocence. Just innocence. So
okay.
you're saying that it is something that transpires. It can be emotionally, physically, whatever to you, but you're not. It's not. In other words, if you went out and shot somebody and they shot you back, you're not the victim, because basically you initiated that, and so they shot you back. So are you really the victim at that point?
The way I use the word victim, yes. Okay. The issue of innocence and guilt in the process, I don't think is material to what the wound is or how it functions. I think victimhood is when the event of being wounded, which could be self-inflicted, it could be culturally inflicted or environmentally inflicted or personally inflicted. It's just, there's a wide variety. But when I'm the wounded person, I am a victim. I have experienced a wound. Okay. But when that becomes my identity past the wound itself, okay, now I've entered into victimhood, which is a quality of identity that is derived from being victimized. And that's where I think the challenge is, because a person can then say, I was hurt by an abusive father. And that could have been last night. And I still am bruised, and I still have welts, and I still have damage in my internal body. And the wound is very present in me. But if that becomes something that was 35 years ago, and my father is dead, and there's been no cause or possibility of legal action, the abuse itself has stopped. But I still see myself primarily as a victim, under not only the influence, but the control of that wound. I have entered into victimhood.
Okay, that I can live with, because I think you helped get it clearer now for us, is that being a victim is about the wounding, and if we're going to try and get this succinctly, it's about the wounding to me. Victimhood is about where I move beyond that and allow that to control my life, my identity, and I get lost in that world of being the victim.
The people who are in victimhood don't necessarily consciously allow it to happen. I mean, the idea behind the words of "I allowed it to take over my life" becomes unhelpful to me. I think to say simply, it has taken over the control of my life. Exactly how that happened, that really is the subject of what we want to talk about, because did I allow it? Am I a participant in the victim identity? Is that something that I actually had no ability to respond to? Those are very, very complicated questions. We're not trying to be psychotherapists here. So it's the idea of deep psychic wounds that go back decades in a person's life. We're not just saying that, hey, we're going to solve all this problem for everybody who's watching in one easy step. It's not about that. But the issue is when a person within their overall social or work environment or relationships that they have takes the status of being a victim to the level of victimhood and now utilizes that to be able to control other situations and persons. Now we have an addiction to victimhood that becomes really useful.
Right. And that, back to our definition, is about control, about identity, about time, how that falls together and plays together, where now, whether I would say you have consciously allowed it or it is developed in your life, victimhood is that becomes how you are living your life. Sure. Because it goes back to those two questions. What am I going to do about it? And what's it doing to me? And what am I going to do about it?
That's the first question. Don't reverse the order.
Yeah, whatever. So
it's not whatever. The critical question is, if I can't answer the question, what is this doing to me?
Exactly.
I'll never get to the question of what can I do about it.
I know.
And
so
go ahead.
So the reality is that you can use that on the flip side of, this is what it's doing to me now I'm a victim, and this is what I'm going to do about it. I'm going to use it to be able to control my environment. So,
or at least attempt to control my environment.
Maybe be helpful if we gave some examples of what we've looked like. So why don't you go first?
And be real careful with this.
Absolutely.
Be really careful with this.
Oh, absolutely. You bet. So give me one. Give me an example.
I was talking with a person who was summarily fired from a job that person loved. It was a great fit. They were well trained. They had all the qualifications, and they were very, very productive. And a new administration came in, and the person who was the new boss walked into the office and said, "You're done, pack your box up. There's some security people here who are going to walk you out. We don't want you to touch the computer. We don't want, just gone." And so there was a tremendous wound, a great distrust. There was hurt, loss of income, loss of status, personal pain, very great challenges. Everything that goes with being summarily let go from a job that was delightful.
Right.
The challenge came when several years had gone by, and the person was terrified of even applying for new jobs because in that person's mind, I'm just going to get fired again. So appeals to family members and friends for money, for opportunities, for sorrow, feeling empathy for my poor status as this fired individual was unceasing. The person dominated virtually every conversation that came up of any importance at all by injecting into the conversation, "Oh, I was fired once from a job. It was several years ago. I never really recovered from that." And so what's interesting is anyone in a conversation could say, "I was on my way over here and my tire blew. I got over to the side of the road. I had to call AAA. That's why I was late getting to the party." And the victimhood individual would say, "Yeah, that's tough. When my life blew out, it was really hard for me to recover." It's like, we're not talking about that. But the victimhood status now applied to I can control any conversation. I can excuse the fact that I never went on from that I mistrust everyone in my life. Every person who has authority went spread over into the ever, never, always language. And the person held on to their victim status kind of as a badge of honor. Look what I've been through. I'm a real loser, and I get to be the center of the conversation. And now, several years later, the individual says, without necessarily using words, don't you feel sorry for me? You had a tire blowout. Yeah, boo-hoo. I had my life blowout. Can we make the conversation about me? And it was very interesting because immediately everyone else in the conversation, everyone else in the environment was quite uneasy, now walking on eggshells. What do you say? How do you proceed? Who's going to open their mouth and make the next comment? The individual who was the wounded permanent victim in living in victimhood now can control, totally remove the central person from the conversation exactly as they were treated, summarily dismissed from telling the story about having a tire blowout, and made it all about that individual. That was an addiction to victimhood at a repeated level. I would say it was extraordinary, but it really is not extraordinary. It is really something that I've encountered and worked with people in business, in families, in churches, in social organizations, that an individual who has the biggest victim identity gets to kind of control what's going on through their victimhood status. That's an example. You got another one?
As you're talking, I'm just thinking there's like how many hundreds fly through my mind here and trying to explain them or put them in.
Yeah, pick one.
I know. I think that one of them that's...
See, I have 8 or 12 of those. You have hundreds of thousands. You win. I'm just like nothing here contributing to it. We're going to actually play this out. You're going to hear people. You yourself might actually use these expressions on occasion. So when I'm doing it as a teaching method. And if you don't agree with that, that just ravages me inside. And I can see in your face through technology, of those who haven't even seen this video yet, I can see how vicious you are about the fact that I have such few people that I've worked with, and that Mike is really in control of this conversation. And he's laughing at me again, which further hurts my feelings.
That's right. That's right.
So I'm going to go eat some worms.
I think that one of the, there's two that come to mind that are kind of powerful. One of them is just one I've observed from afar, and I'm trying to know how to say this because it's a really good illustration and not give away too much here in this context. But let's say that there is a person who loses the spouse, and particularly as people get a little older, I think that they have a little harder time trying to understand and to move beyond that. And yet it's very, very doable to be able to learn how to grieve, learn how to get that in right perspective, be able to not put yourself as the victim of now I'm all alone, the glory years where, we were going to spend our life together, traveling the world and so on and so on. And there's an individual in our community here that could not get beyond it. In fact, what he was doing...
Well, whether that person could or could not, the best thing to say is they didn't.
They didn't. They didn't get beyond it.
We don't really know if they could have.
Right.
But they did not move beyond that wounding event.
But what I saw happen was a community that, and it ended up in the media, so it's, it's public, so I can share that. Where for, and he's still doing it. Every day he would drive to the cemetery, get his chair out, sit next to the grave every day. Well, what transpired as I watched this was this whole victimhood part now, that when he became someone that people were looking to, he kept playing that role because now he had everyone's attention. He had people that were responding to him in all kinds of ways.
Okay.
Where before, and so it just perpetuated this mentality of, oh, poor me, look how awful my life is. I lost my wife of 50 years or 40 years or whatever it was, which was really fascinating because when I first saw it and I would see him, because I would drive by and I'd see him, my first thought was, Bud, it's time. Is this really your life? But people do that all the time, from the standpoint of when it's unhealthy, they don't grieve, they don't move through, they become the victim. And so that happens particularly, you and I have both seen it, where someone loses a child and they lose their identity, and they will fight in an inordinate amount of energy and time to maintain somehow that victimhood status that allows me to still be dad or mom, because I won't let go. And I share that everywhere, and I share that from the standpoint of, just look how awful this is, how awful this is. Now, I personally have had significant loss in my life, with losing of my spouse when she was 45, 13 years ago. And what's fascinating in that whole thing is that I and my 5 kids, we don't see ourselves as the victim at all. We're a victim from, I get that part, but victimhood, no. But yet we have other close friends and family who won't let go of it, and their identity still there. And what's that done? It's actually because they have maintained a victimhood mentality. It has pushed them away from the relationship with us because the hurt's so deep, but they won't let go of that hurt. They won't work through and move through that hurt, and it's controlling their lives and controlling their identity.
So in our theory of motivation, this is, as you're talking about that, it flipped my mind over to our understanding of how motivations work.
Right.
Motivation is the link between my emotion and my behavior. It's how I process what I perceive and what I feel in preparation for whether I act or I do not act. So the motivational complex fits in there. A conversation or words is the most fluid, and an opinion or a viewpoint is less fluid, more fixed. Values, and then habits, and finally culture. And I think what we're saying is, when a wound, which you can talk about and may actually be part of your viewpoint of the damage was caused, and I understand the forces that were in play, all those things. Those are conversations or their viewpoints. When it now becomes my identity, I am a orphan. I am a divorced person that was ravaged by my spouse. I am a failed business owner. I am a individual who has suffered great harm, and I have not moved beyond it. This is now who I am. We're talking about the level of culture or identity, which is the most fixed of the motivational structures, the hardest to change, the least fluid. And I think that's what we're really getting to
Yes.
in this podcast is there is an aspect of victimhood experience that when it becomes my culture,
Right.
this is now my identity. I have taken such ownership of that and given the control of my life to that,
Right.
that I explain to myself or validate to myself, there is nothing I can do to change this. This is who I am.
Right.
And that's what we're trying to address, an addiction
Well,
to victimhood. So let's get
which
out of analyzing the problem and what do we do with it?
okay. So, but let's back up. Let's move that up again because let's use your example of the story of so the guy blew out the tire, and what happens? He tells this person, and they go right into their thing. Well, when my life blew out, when things fell apart. Well, what is that? That's the level above culture, which is what? Habit.
Habit.
So my habit is that it doesn't matter what you bring to the table in conversation. My habit is I am always going to turn that to my story about me being the victim and my hurts.
Habits, like any kind of action, become refined with skill and practice.
Exactly. That's right.
Turning a conversation to be about me and my wound is something that requires a great deal of finesse because most people don't want the story to be about them, about the other person. They want it to be their own story. Right. And so the permanent victim or the individual who's absorbed into victimhood has to develop a real skill set around making sure that persons around them not only are aware of, but are responding to their victim status.
Right. So we've talked about what does this do to you. Now, what do we do about it? Is the question that you are putting forth. What do you do about it, Michael?
Ultimately, the first question, we call this podcast Gripping Reality, and in challenging everyone to grip their own reality. Some realities are extremely sharp. It's like saying, here's a broken pane of glass, not the safety glass stuff, the kind that makes shards and slivers and incredibly dangerous broken glass. And it's all over your environment to say, get a hold of the broken glass. When it was a plate glass window, it was easy to hold because it was integrated. But now it's shards everywhere. And if you try to grip that, you're going to cut your hands. The glass is going to get into your skin. The wounds are going to be profound. And the way in which you try to grab that is beyond your ability. I understand it. Some realities are so heavy. It is so massive. What happened in the victimization event is truly overwhelming, almost to the point of death, but it did not kill the person. It is too heavy to pick up, or it's too massive, or the victimhood memory is so far back that the individual has a real hard time grabbing. It's like grabbing fog. Where is it really? I mean, you can see it at a distance, but you can't see it up close enough. How do I grab fog and deal with it? So I'm not saying that this is easy, but the question is, if you come to the point of saying, I realize that I have gone beyond the wound itself to now I am, by definition, the wounded person.
Right.
The first question is, do you want to stay there? Is that who you want to be for the next 30 years, 30 months, 30 days, 30 minutes? Is that who you are and you want to stay there? If the answer to that is no, I don't want to stay here, then the rest of this podcast could be helpful to you. But if you say, yes, I do not want to give that up, don't take that away from me, there really isn't much we can do for you because you're saying shattered glass is everywhere. I'm getting cut, and I am going to keep getting cut by that is who I am. And so, okay. I mean, I'm not going to tell you you can't do that.
Right.
You will do that.
Right.
So,
Exactly. That's what you're
okay,
doing.
that's
Sure.
what you're doing. And if you say,
Right.
it's too heavy for me to pick up, I don't know how to pick it up. It's too sharp. It's too hot. It's too high. It's too deep in my life. Whatever your definition, but I want to do that. Then this podcast and ones that we're going to deal with in the future and other resources around your life can be extremely helpful in giving you the skill and the ability to be able to grab it, to take ownership of it, and to begin to do something about it.
Right. And so when we talk about this dynamic of, so when you say, no, I don't want to live that way anymore, that really becomes the gatekeeper to this whole thing in the aspect of your life, because it comes back to what we say is if you really want to move in a direction of changing how life is for you, ownership of what is going on is the first step. So saying I want to be different and change, that's the first step in this whole process, because now you no longer you're moving back from this culture and habit to moving back up what we would call now what viewpoints, opinions, and discussion, where you begin to move it out of that very solid foundational point that says this is my identity, to say, okay, I don't want this identity. I want a different identity.
Okay.
Help me understand how to get there. So that's the part we want to help you with.
So we're not going to actually start a 12-step program for victimhood.
No.
Okay,
No.
we're not doing VA here, Victimhood Anonymous. However, that said, the 12-step program that helps people face and deal with addiction are the same kinds of steps that we would recommend for a person who is addicted to the victimhood status of their lives to be able to start dealing with it. Number one is to admit, I am a permanent victim and I cannot do anything about it. I am powerless over this force. And I'm going to turn it over to God as I understand God, because the power of God is going to help me deal with it. The first step of Alcoholics Anonymous is to be able to say, I am powerless over this. I recognize that, and I am going to submit it to the power of God to deal in my life. That becomes the first step, is that admission or confession and the turning over of the controls of your life, not to the cause of the wound, but to God who oversees.
Which is primary, if you know anything about the dynamics of healing, emotional healing in a person's life. And one of the things that is critical is the breaking of the secret, is coming to the point where you identify by what just Mike is saying. What is that? That is finally breaking the secret that says this wound that's in here, I no longer am going to allow to control my life, or I'm no longer, in whatever form that is, of where it was subjugated upon you or you actually allowed it. But I no longer, I identify the fact that it is controlling my life, giving me my identity and my worth. I no longer am going to allow it to do that. And I put that wound on top of the table that says, here it is. That alone, in my experience of working with folks, is that alone, that therapeutic aspect of opening the secret and getting the secret out in itself has amazing abilities to help you start viewing what's going on in your life, to see it differently than what you've seen it in the past. And it gives you the ability now to be able to say, okay, now that I've got it out here and I understand, and now I can start seeing how it has been affecting all these different areas of my life without even knowing that's what was going on, because you have revealed the secret. So
Sure.
get it on top of the table.
So one of the other 12-step, we're not going to go one step, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That really, there's a lot to learn there, and I really encourage you to find ways of discovering that, activating that in your life, whether it's through a group or a counselor or just doing your own reading. But when we're talking about victimhood as an identity in the motivational structure, that has to do with culture, the way I define myself, and now I function automatically. The driver above that is more fluid is we call habits. Mike mentioned that earlier, and referred to an individual who goes to the cemetery, takes a chair and sits by the grave of his lost love, which is not wrong, it's not unimportant, but it has become such a profound habit. Rain, snow, fog, miserable weather, it does not matter. Other events, birthday parties, special events, work, it does not matter. That habit now has become deeply ingrained. So one of the steps of 12-step is change persons, places, and things. To change persons, places, and things, a fancy way of saying change some of your habits that contribute to your victimhood addiction or whatever addiction happens to be. So, for example, if your habit, this takes self-awareness, your habit is any conversation that just happens to present itself, your habit is you insert your vital story into the conversation to show how much more of a victim you are than others who are expressing. Your habit is you speak up and talk about it. Doesn't resolve it. It doesn't actually deal with the situation at all. It merely accentuates or presents your victim status into any conversation. At least be aware, my habit is I bring my story up every opportunity I have. Change persons, places, and things. I'm going to address that in my own mind and pull back the story. There will be an event at which I could have shared it, but I didn't share it. Right. And if you can do that, you begin to challenge the automatic habits that contribute in towards your culture of being the number one victim in your mind over everyone else in the world.
And I would agree with that. I think that's the next piece of this, until you get to a point where I would say, even you say, oh, well, how do I know if I'm doing okay about this? I would say it's actually, for me, it's pretty simple. And that is, you almost are uncomfortable with sharing the story anymore, because the relatability to you is that you're not the victim. And so it's really not, believe it or not, which I think is tough for a person who is in the midst of this, is it's really not that important to me anymore. I've dealt with it. The wound's been healed.
Well, it becomes less important. It becomes less important when you've actually dealt with the loss, and that becomes an incredibly challenging point to say. But I haven't dealt with a loss, or okay, I'll say it's not all that important, but I walk home and I'm the only one there to fix food for, and my spouse is still in the cemetery, and there's nothing I can do about that. So it continues to be vitally important. The challenge in all of this is finding ways of addressing the addiction to that victim status.
Right.
One of the other 12-step programs, and this is probably going to be good for us to do a follow-up podcast on, is the nature of forgiveness. And we tend to take forgiveness and make it religious. Right. But forgiveness is beyond the realm of pure religion in and of itself. Right. The Greek word for to forgive, is aphiemi. And aphiemi is a regular word in secular culture. It's not It's not a religious word. It wasn't something that God had in his own repertoire, and he was the one who forgives, and nobody else is really allowed to forgive unless they get it from God. So don't hear it that way. The word aphiemi means to let go of something.
Right.
And
Right.
in a judgment case, in a courtroom, when a person says, here is a crime, it happened, but I am not going to prosecute the crime. I am going to forgive the crime, or I'm going to let it go. In a personal wound, to say the abuse happened, it happened. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but to forgive does not say it was all right. It
Right.
is to say, I'm letting go of it. So the
Right.
value of forgiveness is to the person who forgives, not to the one who is forgiven. That's
Right.
extremely important. So when we use the idea of forgiveness, what we're saying is the toxins that are in you, the poison, the acid, the bitterness, the rage, the constant wound, do you want that for your life? Do you want to be perpetually angry or perpetually wounded or perpetually bitter? If the answer to that is no, you don't want the toxin in you, then the cause of the toxin, you begin letting that go.
Exactly.
You forgive. Now, it
Right.
doesn't let the person off a legal hook or a moral hook or any of those. I'm not dealing with that end of it. The question is, if you want it to be gone from your life, then let that go and
Right.
learn the processes of letting go,
Right.
which becomes the process of forgiveness.
Right. And as we finish up, because we'll come back and spend some more time talking about this probably in the next couple of podcasts, because this is not a simple
No.
one and done kind of conversation. But you and I both have felt over the last several weeks, as we've had several discussions about this, is that this is an issue that is so prevalent in our society. And right now, it seems that it has infused itself, or I should say, fused itself to politics and all kinds of things that are out here that are so unhealthy because it's become a way of life for so many people. And I would say, though, as we talk about how do you get to the point of where you start dealing with this wound inside, again, we're not therapists. We're not here to do those kinds of things. And that may be what you need. You need to, you need to put your pride aside, your ego aside, and say, look, this is a serious thing. And I think Mike and I would both agree that if this has to do with, with some kind of form, particularly of sexual abuse or deep emotional abuse or those kinds of aspects in your life, yeah, you should be talking to somebody who knows what they're talking about. Um, at the same time, even in that, uh, we believe strongly in community. We believe that, people don't have close friends anymore. They have no one really to talk to. There was a recent study, particularly about men in the United States. 50 years ago, the average man had two uh, close friends they shared life with. Today, the average man has like 0.5. And so most men have
Yeah,
no
I
one
have a
there
friend that's
talking to him.
0.5, and he lost the entire left side of his body, right split right down. It was awful, terrible, terrible accident, but he's all right now. So how do you have 0.5 friends? Oh, I get it. You have one friend and I have none. So
There
between
you
us,
go.
we have a
We have
half
five
friend
friends.
on average.
That's right. That's what I said.
Okay, all right, I get
All
that.
right, enough. So, hope this has been helpful to you today. We'll come back and we'll talk to that 0.5 friend of yours when we get a chance that's split in two. And we're not going to go whether it's red or blue, but they've been split in two. Ha! So so that you might be able to deal with what we've talked about today. That was really bad.
I know. Now, for those of you who are still watching after this incredibly entertaining and somewhat frustrating podcast, you're probably picking up the fact that we think we know what we're talking about. We have a great, between the two of us, we have like 97 years of experience in working with people. I have 94 of them, and Mike has 5. But nonetheless, what we inject is some level of humor, and that's, in a certain sense, the way we actually deal with life altogether. There are some things that are so painful about that if you can't find a way of joking about it, it's going to destroy you. It's going to eat you up inside. It would eat me up inside. And so some ways of deflecting some of the pain is to laugh about it. And which is really interesting, because if somebody comes to bully you and they are extremely threatening and overwhelming, if you can find some way of laughing at the bully, it may make them swing at your face. They might miss, they might connect, but you're going to get something to laugh about out of it. I mean, the reality is it's all of it. It's all the emotions. It's all the struggle, thinking it all the way through. And we tend to, instead of having these be heavy, overwhelming, purely theoretical discussions, it's how we have learned how to live life. And what we want to do is share some of the actual real resources by which we ourselves live and what we can teach others. So we got more to say on this. We really do. And if you have something you want to write back to us, you can write to Myke at GrippingReality and spell that with a Y for me, or I for Mike Wilson. Just pick either way. Just don't write to Mikey, Mikey. I hate that. That's from Life Cereal. Let's get Mike. He likes everything. No. So it's Myke at GrippingReality. Mike with a Y, Mike with an I, and send a response or an email or a question, and we will dig into that a little bit further. We got a lot more to talk about on this topic, but that'll give you some ideas of what to start with.
So thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. Have a great one.